Good evening, y'all. I'm bringing out my Austin. Finn and Jackson, we start at 7. Thank you. That's it. Yep. That's my bad. I looked at him and he got scared. So we're just going to start off by listening to a song. I'm not quite feeling up to chops with leading it yet. So we're just going to listen through it. It's called Holy Forever. It's a really powerful hymn. Caden, if you could press 1 for me. So we'll just listen through it, and then in future weeks, we'll probably sing it over and over. I encourage you to listen to it in your own time if you want to get more used to how your voice works with the song, since the lead parts on this are very high and very loud, at least for the recording that we have. So I'm just going to play it, and we'll be good. Lisa, could you click through for the slides? Thank you so much. All right. And then let me know if it's not loud enough, and I will figure something out. Oh, well, my...
1,000 generations falling down in worship to sing the song of ages to the Lamb. And all who've gone before us, and all who will believe, will sing the song of ages to the Lamb. Your name is the highest, your name is the greatest, your name stands above them all thrones and dominions, all powers and positions, your name stands above them all, and the angels cry, holy, all creation cries, holy, you are lifted high, holy, holy forever. If you've been forgiven, and if you've been redeemed, sing the song forever to the Lamb. If you walk in freedom, and if you bear his name, sing the song forever to the Lamb. We'll sing the song forever and amen, and the angels cry, holy, all creation cries, holy, you are lifted high, holy, holy forever. Hear people sing, holy, to the King of Kings, holy, you will always be, holy, holy forever. Your name is the highest, your name is the greatest, your name stands above them all thrones and dominions, all powers and positions, your name stands above them all, and the angels cry, holy, all creation cries, holy, you are lifted high, holy,
Awesome. So we will pause. We will sing that in future weeks, and we will learn that song. But for now, pass it over to Austin.
Okay, we are getting close to the end of our study of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, we're going to start tonight in verse 13. And as we kind of start in Matthew 13, I want to kind of lay some groundwork. Kind of remind us of the historical context, maybe a little bit of the textual context that we're studying. How, at least to my understanding, many first century Jews, many Second Temple Jews, believed that they were saved by virtue of their descent, by the fact that they were descendants of Abraham, that they would go, I'm saved, I'm a child of God. And you'd go, why? Well, I am a grandson, or great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Abraham. And especially the Pharisees, as we've talked in previous classes, had this special, if I can say it this way, problem of believing that they were saved, not only because they were a child of Abraham, but look at all the works of external righteousness. Look at all the good deeds that I have done. I think the Bible tells us that we need to be lights. We need to do good works. Yes, but it's also the heart that matters. And so as we come to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, in this last section, Jesus saves his final words, if I can say it this way, the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount for those who claim to belong to God, for those who claim to be a child of God, but don't live like it. And as I was reading and studying and thinking through this text today, I think a lot of times some of the things we see in this text, we often maybe compare those of us in the church with those of us, maybe those in the world around us. But most of the Sermon on the Mount seems to be aimed at religious people, at people wanting to be in the kingdom. So I just want to look at this text from that perspective. Look at those of us who consider ourselves to be a child of God, who claim to belong to God, and ask ourselves, do we really live like it? There in the text, as we're getting started, I think we're going to see that the genuineness of our faith is not just found in the fact that we can profess or we can confess to be a Christian, but how we live it out. And there in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 13, Jesus says this, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. You know, as I was thinking through this today, and I ran this idea by Allison, I said, the image that comes to my mind, the contrast, is a 4-lane interstate. It's 4 lanes on both sides. Really wide, really smooth, no curves. It's one of those that if you're not careful, you can find yourself creeping well above the speed limit. Like in Texas, that speed limit would be something like 75 or 80. Here it's more like 60, but very easy to go very fast. Versus those country roads, perhaps the roads closer to eastern Washington in the mountains, where if you blink and you're not paying attention, it's like a 1,000-foot drop and you're going for a tumble and you didn't mean to. That's the contrast I see there in the text. One is an easy drive, one is a hard drive. One, you don't really have to pay attention as long as there's no traffic. And one, if you don't pay attention, your life is in danger. And Jesus remarks there in verse 14, how narrow is the gate and difficult is the road that leads to life, and few find it. Jesus is telling us there in the text that there are 2 ways we can live life. There are 2 gates we can go through. There are 2 destinations that we will experience, or people will experience. And it was very common in ancient Judaism, especially Second Temple Judaism at the time of the 1st century, to talk about the way of entering the kingdom. It's kind of like what you see there in Psalm chapter 1, that incredible psalm that kicks off the book of Psalms. It contrasts those 2 ways of living, and this kind of builds on that idea of 2 different ways of living. And that narrow way, the difficult way, the hard way versus the broad way that has overtones linguistically of prosperous and ease there in the text. Before we dig too deep and maybe some applications, what do you notice there in the text? What jumps off to you there in the verses 13 and 14? When we look at the two gates there. Let me ask it this way. Why is the narrow gate called the narrow gate? What makes the narrow way, the narrow gate, so difficult for us? Why is it so hard for us to follow Christ?
The silence is deafening, but I'll throw something out here.
Yeah.
So it's a narrow gate, the implication being that few can get through it.
Yep.
And yet we perhaps at times get caught up in trying to be as close as we can to as many people as possible.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if few are going to get through, but somehow we take comfort in not being amongst the few, but trying to have a larger crowd around us as possible.
Mm-hmm. So help me understand. Were you saying that, because the way I understand this text is the narrow way is the way of Christ, the one that's difficult, the
Yeah,
one that
sure.
requires self-denial,
Yeah.
and the broad way is the one that requires zero self-denial.
I'm suggesting that perhaps at times we may sacrifice the clear way that is Christ only
Yeah.
to have some comfort
Yes.
on the fringes
Yes.
with folks that maybe aren't adhering as closely to that as possible.
So we start making some compromises there in the text. And it's so easy for us to compromise to, the way some people have described it, is this really stuck with me, is to settle for casual Christianity. Like Christianity without commitment, Christianity without the cross. Daryl, a couple of weeks ago, quoted Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And if you haven't read his book, Cost of Discipleship, again, standard disclaimers, but it's a really, really good book that really digs into the idea of discipleship and really forces you to think, am I a casual Christian, or am I really counting the cost? Am I really following Christ? To your point, that I think we do compromise. That we find little areas in our life, perhaps, I don't want to steal my thunder for Sunday, but maybe we leave a couple of idols on the throne of our hearts that we're really not willing to get rid of. Idols that maybe provide us with a little comfort in this life. We're not willing to make those changes that we need to make. We're not willing to totally and completely deny ourselves. I'm going to stop right there because I may start preaching my sermon. Yeah.
Well, first of all, the Cost of Discipleship is not a fun read. So it is,
No, it's not.
it takes a long time to go through that, man.
Okay, so why does it take a long time? Is it because it's so deep or convicting?
It's the way it's written,
Yeah.
coupled with sort of the concepts that it's
Yeah,
trying to convey.
yeah.
It's not a casual read,
Yeah.
right? It's not like the whodunit. Anyway, but there's this dilemma that's going on, and I like the way Luke puts it in Luke 13 when he says, "For I tell you, many will seek to enter and will not be able." So it's not that they aren't seeking. It's not that they don't see the narrow gate. It's that they choose not to take that pathway.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's what we've got to dig into, and I think this plays into all of the things that he's been saying till now.
Yeah.
Because the heart bar for Christianity is really, really high. The execution bar is an ebb and flow based on life
Yeah.
and the realities of it, and God makes that clear that that's the power of grace. But it doesn't lower the bar in terms of expectation.
So let's dig into that idea from Luke there for a second. Why do we struggle? And I'm using we because I'm assuming you have the same struggles that I do. Why do we sometimes struggle to choose to follow Christ? Like, come Friday morning and we're having to make decisions about how we're going to start our day. Why is it easier for us to grab a Krispy Kreme donut than it is for maybe us to stop and pray or to open our Bibles. Why is it, and to read God's Word, why is it harder for us to follow Christ? What makes it so challenging? Why is that choice so, why are we so inconsistent with that? Discipline, which ties into discipleship, which again, Bonhoeffer kind of unpacks a little bit of in his book.
But there's a question, so the way you stated it though, I've gotta ask you, see, I guess I see it as the pathway leading to Christ that he's been talking about, not a daily decision, it's a life decision, it's a pathway decision. And as opposed to like, well, today I'm walking the wide path, tomorrow I'm walking the narrow path.
Yeah.
I don't see it that way. I don't think the text kind of conveys itself that way. I think the text conveys itself, it's like the Joshua, choose this day who you're gonna serve, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, here are the implications of what service means. And there's a lot of people that have too much money or too much this or too much that don't wanna walk that way. They still want Christ, but they don't want the walk with Christ.
So, if I understand you correctly, Chris, you're talking, the Sermon on the Mount is more of direction, you're looking at it from a direction or a process standpoint, and I may be looking at it more from a day-to-day standpoint. And so, but even then, even with the process standpoint, even the lifetime commitment, looking at yourself and going, if I make the decision to follow Christ, here's what's on the line. Here's what has to go.
Right.
And for a lot of people, for a lot of us, that's still a hard decision. If you take away the day-to-day, which I was definitely talking about with the Krispy Kreme donuts, which are delicious. The process aspect of it, the direction of your life aspect of it, that's still a choice when we're confronted with some people go, I'm not willing to go all in. And maybe that's where you are. Maybe that's where I am. That maybe there's an element of my life I'm not going all in and following him. The direction of my life isn't what it needs to be. And I think he kind of unpacks even more of this there in verses 21 through 23, which we may kind of get to hopefully later in class. And as you were talking about that, I'm like, don't steal the thunder from that verse, because that is such a powerful section there.
But you can veer from that path, right? That's not, it's not, you can choose a narrow path and say, I'm going back to the wide path. It's not, that's the confusion I think that happens in religion in general, that somehow, once you made the choice, that's it, right?
Yeah.
But that's not, you've gotta make that choice on a daily basis. You've gotta continue that walk.
Yeah, and so you just answered the question from our class material. Is the decision to enter the narrow gate a one-time choice that you make once and never have to make again? Or is it a choice we make on multiple occasions? It is. Like, you and I, yes, it's about the direction of our life. It's about walking with Christ and having a relationship with Christ. Yes. But at the same time, it's also about waking up each and every day and making the choice, today I'm going to follow Christ. It's about making each choice that we make that day needs to be made through the lens of how is this going to impact my walk with Christ. Yes?
Well, as we get older, we have different times in our life and different situations. And I think the older you get, the more you realize that we're just these little people here, and we need him. We can't get through some of the heartaches that start coming at us on a regular basis and wipe us out. And we need that time right first thing in the morning with your cup of coffee. And you have that time with him, you read his word, and he makes it better.
Yeah.
But if we don't, we suffer trying to figure out all day long and all week long and all month long what to do. But if we just sit down, get out his word, and ask him, he replies. He takes care of us in these different bad situations we get in. And it isn't anything to do with us doing something wrong. It is life, and you better capture that before you get real deep into trouble.
Yeah, yeah. I think Steve, did you have your hands up? Steve, I saw a hand over here.
Yes, I did. If you don't have a follow-up to
No,
that.
you're good, you're good, yeah.
Because what I'm gonna say is, gonna change the subject.
Unless, Rob, did you have a follow-up to, or are you changing the subject?
No, it's a follow-up.
Because I think that's one of the powerful things about starting your day with the word is that kind of gets your mind in the right. It's kind of like, breakfast, you used to hear in school is the most important meal of the day, that if you're a teacher, what do you tell your kids before standardized testing? Or if you were a student, you remember your teachers telling you this. Eat your breakfast. Breakfast is the most important. Starting your day right affects your mindset for the rest of the day. So Steve, let's change the direction on that.
So I'm going off of your slide there that you're talking about making a one-time choice or a choice we make over and over again.
Yeah.
So I'm intentionally going to use an example that many in the room may not agree with me on the example, but that's okay. If someone asked me, what's the best gospel lesson you've heard in the last 3 years? My answer would be really easy. A couple of years ago, Tony and I went to the Ark Encounter, Noah's Ark thing, and Ken Ham, who is the guy that started that and runs it and all that, gave, to my way of thinking, the best lesson I have heard in a really long time. And he was kind of working around the Ark. He was kind of working around the beginnings. But he said, just really in a very straightforward, commanding way, he said, here's the deal. You're either going to accept the Bible for what it says, or you're not. You're either going to do it, or you're not. And he said, so here's the deal for me. I believe in my heart, I believe that the world was created in 7 days. That's what the Bible says. It says he did this, and at the end of the first day there was evening, and there was morning on the second day, and then he did this. And there was evening, and there was morning, and there was evening and morning. And I know a lot of people that don't believe that those 7 days are literal. But his point was so good, because he said, if you get to that spot in Genesis right there, and you say to yourself, well, I'm not really sure that actually happened in 7 days, you're going to take that thought stream every other place in the Bible. And we're either going to accept his word for what it says, or we're not.
Yeah.
And then he went through and just started talking about all the places today where we go, well, yeah, I know it says that, but
Yeah.
I just love that lesson, and
Yeah.
I have thought about it over and
Yeah.
over and over again. You're either going to make a one-time choice to live God's way, or you're going to make a different choice over and over again. I know it said that, but.
Oh man. So I'm gonna, my follow-up to that, yes, I like that. I think one of the biggest struggles we face as a society is the fact that we pretty much ignore Genesis 1 through 11. Like, so many of the foundational issues that we face as a society go back to not understanding and ignoring and trying to explain away, as Steve has said, Genesis 1 through 11. That if we look at Genesis 1 through 11 and say, this is God's word, this is God's will, this is what God wants from us, this is God's pattern, what God desires from his creation, we just go back to that. Like, 95% of the issues we face today would probably be solved. Or it would at least be solved easier.
True story.
Yes.
So I know that there's a number of us that were not raised in the pews and came out of the world, and this is, I'm going to go back to what Chris said, that I don't know that it's a one-time
Yeah.
choice, because when I came out of the world and became a Christian, there were things that we changed our entire life.
Yeah.
And then, as we matured as Christians, it's like, there's a certain aspect of, I don't know, if people can have a different opinion than I do about, secular holidays like Christmas.
Yeah.
But those are things that, as you mature as a Christian, then some of those things that we just didn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole, realize that really probably,
Yeah.
So I think it's a lifetime journey, a maturity, but we do, again, have to understand that on a daily basis, we're making decisions that impact our eternal destiny, right? But it's a struggle as we
Yeah.
come out of the world and try to recognize what is really a distraction from our spiritual life.
It's a journey that begins with a choice. But that choice needs to be followed up with daily choices that are part of that process, that part of that walk, that continue that direction. It keeps us on the narrow path. Chris?
Contextually, these Jews are gonna have to make a decision.
Yeah.
They're gonna have to choose Christ.
Yeah.
And there's no other way that they can, all of them would be monotheistic in this audience, right? So they were God, but they weren't gonna necessarily choose Jesus. And he's saying here, there is no other way.
Yeah.
That, the things that you're gonna hear from this point forward are gonna point directly to me. And if you're gonna try to get through God through anything other than your priest and king, it's not gonna work.
Yeah. Yeah. It's calling, like as Chris has pointed out, I'm glad he brought it back to the context and the text. We've been talking a lot about the application to us. But back in the text, this is a choice the Jews have to make. The Jews sitting there as Jesus is preaching this Sermon on the Mount, they're being prompted to make a choice between the way of the Pharisees and the way of the Sadducees and the way of Second Temple Judaism or the way of Christ. And what he tells them there in the text is that few will find that way. True discipleship, true following of Christ is a minority religion. It will put us in, to borrow this phrase, part of the few and the proud. There in the text. So we've been unpacking that choice. And so he goes from this warning and this challenge to enter through the narrow gate because it's a hard and difficult road to follow Christ, and only a few people are going to be able to do it. That true discipleship is for this few and I shouldn't say the proud, the few and the humble, to build on the language of the Sermon on the Mount. And then he starts by saying, be on your guard in verse 15. Be on your guard against false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but are inwardly ravaging wolves. False prophet. A couple things to unpack there as we look at verse 15. The fact that there could be a false prophet, at least to me, implies that there can be true prophets or true teaching. That there is a standard by which someone can judge a true teacher, a true prophet, and a false teacher, and a false prophet. And over and over and over again in the Bible, Old and New Testament, the biblical writers warn against false teachers and false prophets. And I think Jesus' warning here in the text may even run a little deeper than the standard, what's coming out of their mouth. I wonder, especially in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, it's designed to touch our heart and to get at the heart. I wonder if Jesus is also warning against teachers who appear pious, appear holy, but don't actually live that way. I mean, put yourself again as a first century Jew, and he's talking to Jews who saw the Pharisees who looked righteous, and they looked holy. And everybody will look at them and say, they're the standard. And Jesus is like, beware of those guys. They're sheep in they're wolves in sheep's clothing. You will recognize them, verse 16, by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? In the same way, every tree produces good fruit but a bad tree produces bad fruit. You know, growing up, we had a couple of trees. So when we moved in the house my parents live in today, my parents went out, and my sister and I got to pick a tree. What kind of tree do we want? We both got fruit trees. My sister, as I remember it, got a peach tree. I got a Granny Smith apple tree.
Nice.
Love Granny Smith apples. They're delicious, especially in apple pies. But that peach tree very quickly started producing peaches. Very quickly. And those peaches were delicious. But it didn't take long before those peaches were bad and it stopped producing fruit. And last time I checked, the best I can remember, we actually ended up cutting that peach tree down because it stopped producing fruit. The Granny Smith, last I remember, was still producing fruit. But Jesus is saying, you know a tree and the quality of a tree by the fruit it produces. Does it produce good apples? Does it produce good peaches? Does it produce good bananas? Or does it not? That a good teacher produces good fruit and a bad teacher produces bad fruit. Every tree that does not produce good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So you will recognize them by their fruits. What is Jesus trying to teach the crowds here in the text? What is the big lesson that he's trying to leave in their minds as he's describing these false teachers and the pattern of life of these false teachers?
They're teaching something that leads to sickness.
Yeah. That. So unpack the leads to sickness. So what kind of sickness? I think I understand where you're going, but unpack that a little bit for me.
Well, it's either gonna be good fruit or it's bad fruit.
Yeah.
It's either gonna taste good or you're gonna spit
Yeah.
it out.
So a false teacher, to kind of build on the sickness illustration, a false teacher is going to lead you to spiritual sickness?
Yes.
There we go. Okay, there we go. Make sure I followed up.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think that's right. That you, yeah.
I was gonna add that they're also hard to recognize,
Yeah. Why are false teachers hard to recognize?
because there's some truth in what they're saying.
Yes.
But it's not,
Yes.
not the whole truth.
You know, if you really break it down and compare the various, I'm going to use this phrase, families of faith within Christendom, I would say like 80% all of them agree on, right? I think that would be a fair assessment. Generally speaking, trying to be fair to every family of faith. It's the 20% that we disagree on, we wrestle with, and we try to study, and we're disagreeing on various texts. You know, a lot of false teachers have a kernel of truth. And so what does that mean for us as we're trying to distinguish between false and true? What does it mean for the Jews living in the first century as they're trying to distinguish between false prophets and true prophets, false teachers and true teachers? What does that mean for them? Lisa?
Just think back the idea of how hard it is, especially if you go back to this time period, to look at like the Pharisees and the brand of Christianity or Jewish that they espoused, and how it would have been so like works-based and piousness-based, but
Yeah.
not touching the heart,
Yeah.
and how hard it is to point at that and say bad fruits. Even though it does create bad fruits, it
Yeah.
creates weak relationship with God, and it creates fearful relationships, and it
Yeah.
creates negativity where there should be positivity,
Yeah.
right? There's all these things, but it's super hard to look at that. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to me that he's saying like, look at their fruits, you can tell. And
Yeah.
I think, oh, that's hard.
Yeah, like, and I like to bring it back to the Pharisees, and you're looking at them, and they're doing all these good deeds. They're giving all this money, and doing all this stuff that you would look at, and the world would go, wow. Like we would say, if I can use it, that super Christians. But their heart's rotten. But we can't see the heart. And this is one of those times I wish we weren't recorded.
But we are.
But we are. I'm going to try to watch my words as I say this. There are times and there are situations, and there may even be personal experiences that we have, where we've been in an environment where religiosity is equated with all these external things, divorced from our relationship with God. That I am more spiritual and more righteous because I do X, Y, Z. I do this, this, and this. And I think Jesus, and I think the message of the Sermon on the Mount, I think what Lisa's saying is, especially as we deal with the application, compare and contrast the Pharisees and who Jesus is talking to and put us in the story, try to apply it, that we got to be very careful today that we don't equate righteousness with these righteous acts of piety that are divorced from heart. Lisa and then Chris.
I was just
And then
thinking,
Rob.
a good example of that is when they said that you refuse to take care of your parents because you give it to
Yes.
others.
Yeah.
Right, like totally missing the boat,
Yeah.
right?
That was going through my head. Whatever I would give to you, however I would support you, mom and dad, is well, it's Corbin. It's given to God, and so I don't have to take care of you. Like, think about what you're saying there, Jews. Like, part of your life, part of our responsibility as sons and daughters, is to take care of our parents when they're older, when that time comes.
Oh, listen up.
All the parents in here going, kids? All the grandparents are like, okay, guys, let's. But that's, and so we can get so caught up sometimes in doing good things, and that we forget that we have a responsibility to our family to take care of our family, and somehow, some way, maybe practice a modern day Corbin, and Chris, and then Rob.
Yeah, what are the good fruits that he's talking
Yeah.
about? The good fruits that he's talking about are not the do not murder,
Yes.
do not divorce. They're the things that come before that. The good fruits are the people who are humble and meek
Yeah.
and lowly
Yeah.
and are caring for and are treating others like they would like to be treated, because that's the law and the prophets. Those are the good fruits, right? But that's not the way that even today we measure good fruits. We measure good fruits by activities first instead of attitudes first.
Yes.
Not that the activities don't happen, but they're not the measure. It's the attitude that leads to the activities that really matter.
To borrow what Chris is saying, he simplified what was going into my mind much better than I did. That the activity flows out of the right attitude. And sometimes we get this backwards. That we think we can write activity or attitudes into the right activity into the right attitude. And it's really more often than not the opposite way. That we have to have the attitude right, the heart right, before we can have the right activities, the right actions. Behavior flows from the heart. Yes, Rob?
So I kept thinking of a worldly example where, if you're trying to identify counterfeit money,
Yeah.
the best way to identify that is to study the actual
Yes.
accurate,
Yeah.
so that you can distinguish the difference. So in applying that lesson to this, it's like we have to get back to God's word, because whether it's the Corban that you're giving
Yeah.
and not supporting your parents, or the actions or the attitude,
Yeah.
we've got to know God's will, and that's from His word.
You mentioned the real money thing, and I worked for a credit union at the time, and part of my training they were doing some things there they wanted to get started in outside sales and everything. But part of my training, they wanted to train me as a teller, so I would be well versed in all aspects of the organization. And the interesting thing was, I didn't touch real money, I don't think, until I actually stood behind the counter dealing with customers. Like, you could have passed a fake $100 bill and I wouldn't have known from Moses, because I hadn't touched the real money. I love that analogy. One of the things as we talk about good fruits versus bad fruits, I'm going to use a football analogy to avoid incriminating people too much. I'm going to not even mention names. I had the chance when I worked in football to work around 2 head coaches, both of which are still active. One of it's still a head coach, one of which is an offensive coordinator, both of which have been highly successful in their careers. One of them, everywhere he's gone, he's been successful. He's been at 3 different schools. All 3 programs have won at a pretty high level. And the program has grown, and it's been successful long term. The other head coach, things tend to implode after about 2 or 3 years there. Usually by year 4 with this guy, things start to fall apart. And if you study how they act and how they interact with people, one shows love, one shows care, one's genuine, and one does not. And that bears fruit, and you begin to see the fruits in their success. One builds a long-term program where people love him and adore him. One, the cracks start and the program falls apart. And I think that's the same way with false teachers. That a false teacher comes in and a true teacher comes in. And a false teacher, over time, those bad fruits start to happen. And those cracks start to appear. And things begin to fall apart very easily. And a true teacher comes in and things grow. Things are built up there in the text. Do you guys follow that? Does that make sense? Any thoughts or comments at that point? I think as we look at this, one of the things as you see here in this warning against false teachers, though, I think there may be even a lesson for those of us who serve in leadership capacities, whatever that be, elder, deacon, teacher, preacher, whatever, that leadership and teaching isn't about gifts, but fruits. That we need to be bearing those fruits. And we're going to talk some, I hope, next year. I don't know where it's going to plug in, but my plan is to talk about bearing fruit in some way next year. Okay, we're right there. And any final thoughts all the way to verse 20? Okay, 21. This is where I think we're probably going to spend the rest of our time and leave the 2 foundations for next week. Jesus says there in verse 21, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name and drive out demons in your name and do many miracles in your name?' And Jesus will say there in verse 29, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers.'" So here's something I noticed today, or a book pointed out to me. I'd never noticed this. That Jesus, remember how Matthew is built around 5 different speech sections, and this is the end of the first speech section in the book of Matthew? So right at the end of the very first speech, Jesus gives a warning about obedience and the consequences of religious hypocrisy. At the end of the 5th speech in Matthew, there in Matthew chapter 25, like right before the passion narrative, the crucifixion narrative begins in Matthew 26, Jesus warns again about, hey, hypocrites won't get into the kingdom. Which I think is interesting, that his teaching, his ministry is bookended in the Gospel of Matthew by 2 warnings about make sure that you're actually doing the will of the Father. So I want to start by asking, we'll talk about that. How is Matthew chapter 7, verse 21 through 23 a warning for us? How is Matthew 7, 21 through 23 a warning for us? Yeah, Kevin?
I don't know if this directly answers your question, but I think this very much is still tying into the previous thoughts that Jesus was talking about. And the thing that's been striking me is culturally, for us, like in current times, we're very a results-based focus. At least, my day-to-day life at a major corporation, what matters is, are you increasing profits?
Yeah.
Ultimately. And we take a lot of that mentality, I think, and use that in our spiritual life too. And I think in a way it sounds almost as though Jesus is saying that if you just look at is the tree very good fruit or bad fruit? But when I'm seeing all of this section together, let me back up a little bit. There's also an attitude that we have that our intent, I've had this exact conversation with several other different Christians in the past too. The intent doesn't matter. What matters is the outcome. But when you get to this part now where he's saying, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, like, that's your intent. Like, you can say, Lord, Lord, I love you, I'm a Christian, I'll follow you, but if you don't mean it, it's not gonna get you into heaven.
Yeah.
And I think if you back up then to what the trees bearing good or bad fruit, you can go to church and look like you're doing all the right things, and look like you're saying all the right things, but if you're not doing it, if your heart's not in the right place and you don't really mean it, and you don't really intend it, you're gonna end up with bad fruit down the road, and you're gonna end up in front of God at the end saying, I did all this stuff, why am I not getting in?
Yeah.
And to me, I guess the contrast to my daily life in the world is very different. That there's what you intend to do doesn't matter. If it doesn't work out immediately, you're still a failure. Versus God's method is He wants your heart, and He wants you to be aiming for Him the whole time. He wants you aiming for the narrow gate and on that narrow path. And His grace will take care of you for stumbling, but
Yeah.
if you're not aiming for that and you're just trying to make it look like you are, you're not going to make it.
Yeah, so what Kevin said has so many thoughts running through my mind. And the first thought that I want to say is at the very beginning of what Kevin just shared with us. Ty's been, I think it was Chris who brought this up earlier. The idea of being more process oriented. And that idea of being process oriented has helped me significantly. And what I mean by process oriented is something I got, sorry guys, another football coach, who talked about, a lot of times being results oriented and living in a results oriented society where you go to work and you're judged by the results that you put out there. Students make certain test scores. Did you meet certain, quotas on your, sales goals or whatever you do at work? But the process is less focused on the outcome and more focused on doing things that will help you be successful long term. The way this football coach described it, in a football atmosphere, is rather than getting up and dealing with the wins and the losses, focusing on being the best player you can be. He goes, I just got, this specific coach I got this from, he goes, look, we were about to play the number one team in the country, and we had no business being on the field with them that year. And my job was on the hot seat. He was roughly a 500 coach now, at the time. And he says, guys, we're just going to focus on being the best player we can be. That's what we're going to do. And this unranked 500 football team beat the number one team in the country because each and every member of that team focused on being the best player they could be and doing their job to the best of their ability. And they won. And what ended up happening is this specific coach changed how he coached. And he finished his career with winning 80% of his games. And as soon as he is eligible, will be inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame. All because of a change. And so how does that apply spiritually? That some of the things that you and I can do, not being less results focused as Kevin was talking about, but being process focused. What are the things that we can do that will help us grow to be more like Christ? Going back to the idea of process and direction. Cole, I saw your hand up, and I'm going to stop there for Cole and then Lisa. And I'm going to loop back around to say something about what Kevin said again after Cole and Lisa.
I just want to say I love the emphasis that he puts on himself when he says this. I hope I'm not skipping ahead too far, but like you'll see it said pretty plainly in verse 28 and 29 that he was teaching with one who has authority, not as the scribes.
Yeah.
And I just love that, you know, putting the emphasis on Jesus and
Yeah.
how pivotal he is
Yeah.
for our salvation.
Yeah.
And I think that matters a lot because, I mean, it's
Yeah.
written throughout the entire Sermon on the Mount.
The purpose and the process of discipleship should end with us being more like Christ. So if you and I kind of do things on a daily basis, we should, the end goal, the end result will have us more like Christ. What made Christ so remarkable, as Cole pointed out, and I'm going to try not to steal thunder from next week, but he spoke, as Cole said, as one who had authority. He was different. And the way he lived and the way he walked was different. What he taught was different. And I don't want to steal too much for next week, but I love that. Keep what Cole said in mind for next week, guys. Like, think about it like all week. Lisa.
This question, like, took me back to how you started the class.
Yeah.
Because you asked the question, like, why is it hard to start your day with, like, Bible reading?
Yeah.
And I've been kind of, like, chewing on it the whole class because anyone who's down, like, to read the Bible in a year,
Yeah.
when you clearly set your intention, you
Yeah.
value the scriptures, knows some mornings it is hard to make yourself do that work. And, like, you think, why is it hard? Like, it meets
Yeah.
my long-term goals, it meets my short-term things I've set up for myself. Like, why is it so hard, right? And so I'm thinking about, like, this whole, like, process thing that you're coming around to. And it seems like it's the answer, but it doesn't really answer for me, like, why is it so hard? Like, why is it harder? Why does it seem like it's harder than it should be?
Yeah, so and the answer to why is it harder than it should be, I don't have the answer to it, because if I did, like, I'd be writing books. But I don't have the answer. I'm sorry, but you bring up a good point, because a good question is why is it? Why is it harder than it has to be? Why is disciplining ourselves to wake up every morning, to start our day with prayer or Bible study, or to end our day if we're more of a night owl person? Because some of us are here, I'm going to use the word different, and you're a night owl. I am an early bird, so by definition, you are different than me. And so you maybe think clearly, and you end your day with maybe Bible. Why is it so hard for us to discipline ourselves, to read or to pray, and to make choices that will bring us closer to being like Christ? I don't know the answer to that. Because if I did, I would be able to do that for myself. And I don't always do that. Like, I get caught up in the hustle and bustle and the life that every one of us struggles with. That we're a little tired, so we hit the snooze, and before we know it, hit the snooze like 2 or 3 times, and then Instagram or Twitter or whatever, and before we know it, it's like, oh, I'm running late, and Bible reading gets pushed aside. Chris, I saw your hand in the back.
Yeah, so this is an interesting pattern here, right? Not everyone who says to me, so if you just say it, that's not gonna work, but you gotta do it. And on that day, these guys are gonna say they did it.
Yeah.
And he's not gonna say, no, you didn't do it.
Yeah.
But he isn't gonna say, I never knew you, depart from me. So what that says to me is that doing the will of my Father is something different than what I think a lot of times we look at as doing the will of the Father. Because if it were just that, they did, I mean, there's good things, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with prophesying and casting out demons and doing that kind of stuff. But that wasn't the do he's talking about. And I don't know that I have an answer to what the do is, but I know it's not that.
So can I suggest, because this ties in, I think, with the second part of what Kevin mentioned a moment ago, that what Jesus is wanting us to do is the right heart that does the right thing for the right reasons. That sometimes we may do the right thing, but we do it for the wrong reasons. That our heart may not be in the right place. That we may give money, I'm going to use this as an example to tie in with what happened on Sunday. We may give money to Christians in the Philippines, but we're doing it so we can feel good. Or so everyone knows that we gave to the Philippines. Or whatever, I'm using that as an illustration. we're doing, maybe it's the person that we see when we're in downtown Seattle, whatever it is, we're doing these things, that our heart isn't right. And if you would, or maybe it's religious things. If I can will you guys allow me to read 21 through 23 and put a 21st century American church version on it?
Sure.
That not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, didn't we show up to church on Sunday? Didn't we sing a lot of songs? Didn't we pray to you every day? And on that day, he's going to announce them, I never knew you. They were doing the right things. They were doing biblical things. They're doing things that we're supposed to do. What gives? They didn't have the right heart. And they weren't doing the right thing for the right reasons. What Jesus wants from us is the right heart, who does the right thing for the right reasons. That's how we enter the kingdom. Kevin.
I think this kind of fits with everything that we've been discussing this whole class, but to start with, going back to, again, that first question of like, why is it so hard? And that's kind of been bugging me the entire class, and partly why I didn't have an answer right away.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess like what it comes down to is, I don't think that's a good question.
That's fine. You can say that.
And I think that fits into like what we're discussing. In my mind, at least, it's like why are hard things hard? It's like, because they're hard.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus said, like, why is the narrow gate difficult? Because it's narrow and it's rough.
Yeah.
And so when we ask ourselves, like, why is it so hard for me to read the Bible every day? We're again thinking about a result of I read the Bible today, and I read the Bible the next day, and the next day. I like to do meditation, something I've been working on for a while, and I found out that Daryl has been doing a lot of meditation for a long time, and so I asked him about that. And one of the things that was super impactful to me, he said, was when he started out meditating, you kick yourself when your mind wanders, because your mind's going to wander all the time. But that's the point of meditating, is that every time your mind wanders, you bring it back into focus. And so rather than kicking yourself every time your mind wanders, that's part of your training. That's exactly what you're doing. And so I think when it comes down to doing any of these things that are hard, like that same principle applies.
Yeah.
And it goes back to, that's the process. Like we're growing from the process of every time we start to get tired on the narrow and rough path, or every time we start to wander off the narrow path, if every time we refocus on God and pull ourselves back, it's the process that's getting us there, because that's where our heart was. And we will redirect. And so rather than beating ourselves up because we didn't achieve the result of being on the path perfectly at 100% of the time, and we beating ourselves up because we didn't read the Bible every day of the year, So I guess that's
No, I think you're spot on, and as you're talking about that, like I'm listening to what you're saying, Kevin, and I'm not a meditator. If that helps you, great. I see things, as you guys may have caught on to by now, through the lens of sports, because that's my background, and that's the way I think. But I'm translating what you're saying, and I'm seeing definite parallels, like the process in football and how I've translated that to help me in other aspects of my life. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt that.
Yeah.
For sports, though, do you ever sit down and you visualize a particular play or strategy, or do you think about the game outside of the game? If you don't, you're super weird.
So, but my mind's weird in this. I'm trying not to go down too far down the sports rabbit hole here.
So my point is, multiple famous sports players talk about they will visualize playing the game outside of practice, outside of
Gotcha. I see what you're saying.
Visualize the proper techniques. They'll visualize a particular strategy. That's a type of meditation. That's my point is.
Gotcha. Okay.
He's calling you out for meditating.
Yeah.
My point is, we all meditate to some
Yeah.
degree,
Yeah.
but we can use our, if we do it intentionally, to use a buzzword.
Yeah. Well, to bring this idea back to the Bible, and not, I think what Kevin is saying in terms of meditating, the principle that he just laid before us, is super helpful for us as we try to answer maybe Lisa's question from a moment ago. I don't want to spoil the surprise. I'm going to mention it because you're here. We're probably going to have a congregational reading plan next year. I hope I didn't
That's good.
step out of turn by sharing that. And so you're reading along, and let's say it's February, and we're in Leviticus, because Leviticus is where congregational reading plans go to die. And you sleep in, and you're running late, and you forget to read whatever. If I understand what Kevin was saying, and this may help all of us as we try to do this reading plan. You forget to read on Tuesday, guess what? Get back on the boat and read on Wednesday. And read Wednesday's day. Don't try to read Tuesday and Wednesday. Read Wednesday. Or let's say you were away on vacation for 3 or 4 days. And you come back. Just catch back where you are. Don't worry about trying to make up, because guess what ends up happening when you try to make up? If your experience is like mine, you end up skimming and not actually reading and meditating on it. Like you're trying to get 5 chapters done in 15 minutes, and it's like you're reading like super fast. And so maybe that helps. Maybe that answers a little bit of your question, Lisa. Maybe it doesn't. Yes.
Oh, I was gonna go back to the right heart does the right thing for the right reasons. Jesus kept going over and over that you love God and you love man, and those are the right heart
Yeah.
and the right
Yeah.
reasons all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
When David ate the showbread, the priest gave it to him, it was for the right reason. He was starving,
Yeah.
and over
The-
these things that aren't right.
It's if you go through, and we don't have time to do it tonight because we are at the end of class, and trace what Jesus says about the greatest commands from God. Where do those commands start? Where does love, where does genuine love really start? It starts in the heart, and it's displayed in our actions. Or to use the words that Chris put before us earlier in the class, it starts in our attitude, and it's displayed in our activities. This has been really good in terms of discussion about the heart here in the last little bit. But we're going to look at the last couple of verses of Psalm 7, Matthew chapter 7, next week, and probably do a quick review of the Sermon on the Mount. And the next class, which will probably start in about 2 weeks, we'll look at ideas like, is the Bible relevant? And look at truth over trend. And does the Bible help us today? And how maybe it helps us today. Still kind of framing out that class right now, and that should take us all the way or close to the end of the year. Okay?
Say it.
Plus dismiss. There you go, Daryl.
You won't move until you say it.
We didn't know.